And now we are joined by Dr. Anna Neistat, Legal Director of the Docket at the Clooney Foundation for Justice. Dr. Neistat has worked in international human rights for over 2 decades and investigated more than 60 conflict areas around the world and has held executive research positions at Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. We are delighted to have her here with us now. Dr. Neistat, thank you very much for coming to Rush Tomorrow. I'm really glad to see you here.
Hello, thank you.
My first question is about Russian propagandists. Do you think they really can be tried for their propaganda in the tribunal?
The short answer is yes, and there are historical precedents for that, and that's definitely one of the cases that we are also working on. It's not very straightforward, legally speaking. There are several options. The most well-known one is probably the crime of incitement to genocide. This is what came out, for example, in the Rwanda tribunal some years ago. And in fact, one of the people accused of that crime is just now facing justice, a few decades after the crimes were committed. But it is a crime under international law. It is a crime under Rome Statute, the statute that the International Criminal Court is operating on. But the facts of this, the elements of this crime, are not very easy to establish.
I want to talk to you maybe more specifically. You've already mentioned the case of Felicia Kabuga of Rwanda, who is now judged in The Hague after decades, as you said. My first question, if we can really compare the methods of propaganda which was done in Rwanda and of modern propaganda in Russia, and if we are talking about Rwanda case as precedent, how soon these propaganda figures can be captured and judged?
It is similar and it is not, right? I think in one way, what we saw in Rwanda was much more explicit and much more direct. And in some ways, the tragic and the easy part was that in Rwanda, genocide was established as a crime. And so it was much easier to link the statements to what was happening on the ground. I think in Ukraine, it's a little bit harder. And also the methods of propaganda have become much more elaborate. It is not as direct, but unfortunately no less efficient, and probably more efficient, because what Russian propaganda is now doing is playing with images, playing with vocabulary, playing with terminology. And in some ways it is, I would say, overall a little bit more subtle, or it appears to be a little bit more subtle, but in some ways it is even more efficient and thus destructive. So I do think for lawyers like ourselves, for those who are putting together all of these statements and imagery that is being pushed out on a variety of Russian channels right now, it is a little bit probably harder task than for those who worked on Rwanda. But ultimately, I don't think there is any question as to what they're doing and how they're doing this. That said, I do hope that it will not take as long. After all, Rwanda Tribunal was one of the first international tribunals. We didn't have the International Criminal Court back then. But most importantly, and one of the ways in which we are trying to use international justice system in its modern form is through so-called universal jurisdiction, which means that it does not have to be an international tribunal, because they all take a long time, no matter how efficient they are or how they're trying to be efficient. But there are all of these countries, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Germany, Poland, Lithuania, and many, many others around the world that do have these articles in their criminal codes. And it means that they can open criminal cases. And if we and other lawyers are able to convince them that the case is strong, it means that they can issue international arrest warrants, or arrest warrants that then will turn into Interpol red notices. And that is a completely different ballgame, right? First of all, it usually takes less time because national justice systems are usually more efficient than international justice system. And second of all, it means that if this system is used efficiently, it does create this net in which it is much easier to catch those figures than, for one court that would, in the end, only be able to try, 1, 2, 3 perpetrators, but definitely not all of them. But I do think it's critically important to open these cases around the world in all of the countries that can technically do that, so that no matter where they go, and they will go, right?
From Russia, you mean they can go and
I think so. I think they will. And many of them already have foreign residencies and foreign citizenships and properties abroad, and children going to schools elsewhere, right? So I think it is much likelier that these figures compared to, Russian submarine commanders that we're also trying to chase, that these figures will go somewhere. And the critical piece is that no matter create a world in which no matter where they go, they will be able to be handed over to a justice system that would be able to bring them to account.
So it may not be The Hague as we usually imagine that in the future.
It doesn't have to be. I mean, again, I do very much hope, and one of the things we're working on is that the International Criminal Court does add the charge of incitement to genocide to its collection of charges that is currently pursuing in the Ukraine investigation. I think it's very important symbolically, even if in practical terms it might take longer or may not lead to some tangible results, but symbolically the message is very important. But I do think in practical terms, it is really not just The Hague. We are living in the 21st century where the system of international justice is quite advanced. And there are lots of countries that have both technical means, legal means, and in this situation, quite a lot of political will to pursue it. And, we should be using that.
It's really interesting to hear. And I also want to ask you, is there any limit of how far this investigation could get into a regime? Which levels of these figures, propaganda figures, war figures, can be captured and judged?
Well, when it comes to propaganda figures, it's pretty much all the way, right? It's not just the journalists, it's not just the anchors, it's really the owners of the TV channels, potentially shareholders. So anybody who's involved in the promotion of the propaganda, not just physically articulating it, but enabling it, could be held to account. When it comes to, if your question is broader, one thing that this system of universal jurisdiction cannot do is bring to account heads of state, usually, because they would enjoy diplomatic immunity, and it's literally either the International Criminal Court or a court which will be specifically created. There's a lot of talk now about creating this hybrid tribunal for Ukraine that would specifically address, for example, the crime of aggression, in which, again, the propaganda figures also might be figurants. But it is for figures like, the president of Russian Federation, it would have to be an international or internationalized court that would have sufficient authority to overcome diplomatic immunity that he would otherwise enjoy.
And as I know, you've already traveled to Ukraine, and you picked a lot of evidence of war crimes and also make some comparisons with war crimes in Chechnya and Syria. And I want to ask you if the evidence that we already have are enough to pass to a new step, maybe, of the investigation of the process of the future tribunal in The Hague, which was already started, as I know.
Yes. So, actually, I just came back from Ukraine. We have been on the ground with my organization since almost the first days of the war. And we're working on different patterns of violations, including unlawful killings, indiscriminate attacks, executions, torture, sexual violence, and many others. We do not work so much with the International Criminal Court. We're really focused on national courts in other jurisdictions, partially because International Criminal Court, they do have their own investigation. They do send investigators to Ukraine. I think it is very important that there are so many people working on Ukraine, including in the accountability space. So we work in our niche, which I think is the most efficient one. But it's actually progressing. I think in terms of our cases, we obviously there is no end in sight of what is happening. And I was just there mainly in the liberated areas in the Kharkiv region, focused mostly on executions and disappearances and unlawful detention, just when the attacks happened on Monday, right? And that's pretty much what happens every time we go to Ukraine. We would focus on something and then something. I mean, it is, an investigation that happens in an active war zone where violations continue to happen as we speak. However, with some of the cases that we started a few months ago, I think we have sufficient evidence, both of the crime base, meaning, what happened, but also on linkage, which is very important, which means who did it. In Ukraine, so far, it's been relatively easy to establish the perpetrators. And obviously, because we're talking about criminal cases, we have to name the names of the actual perpetrators, of their commanders, and all the way up the chain of command. And I do think by now we kind of putting this puzzle more or less together and getting ready to file them in different jurisdictions on behalf of Ukrainian survivors who are now there in Germany, in Poland, in Slovakia, in the Netherlands, and so on.
Thank you very much for this conversation and for some maybe new point of view on this future process of judging.